Please just let me keep it," were the words 8-year-old Leo would have screamed if his voice hadn't been locked behind a wall of silence for 3 long years. Instead, the boy could only offer a muffled gasp as a heavy, mud-caked boot pressed down on his small hand, pinning him into the freezing muck of the Hudson River bank. Above him, a man with a jagged scar across his eyebrow and a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes laughed, dangling a broken silver pocket watch just out of the boy's reach. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the only thing Leo had left of a father he couldn't remember, and now it was being treated like trash by a predator who enjoyed the scent of fear. But what the man with the scar didn't know was that from the porch of a weathered 2-story house just 50 yards away, a pair of eyes as sharp as a hawk's and as cold as a winter grave was watching everything. Those eyes belonged to a man the world had forgotten, a man who had spent 30 years pretending to be a ghost, but who was about to prove that some ghosts still have teeth. Watch this story until the very end, because what happens when a man who has lost everything finds something worth fighting for will leave you breathless. Before we continue, I want to ask you to do something special. If you believe that justice should always find a way, hit that subscribe button and join our community. It helps me keep bringing these powerful stories to life for you. And please stay with me until the conclusion, and then leave a comment giving this story a rating from 0 to 10. I read every single one of your messages, and your support means the world to me. Now, let's look closer at the man standing on that porch. His name is Elias Thorne. To the residents of the nearby town of Oakhaven, he is nothing more than a 72-year-old eccentric who lives on the edge of the water where the morning mist clings to the jagged shoreline like a funeral shroud. He moves with a slight, rhythmic limp, the result of a cold winter night in 1994 that he never speaks about. He wears faded Carhartt jackets that smell of wood smoke and machine oil, and he rarely says more than 3 words at a time. Most days you can find him sitting on his private pier, a fishing line dropped into the dark, churning depths of the Hudson, or hunched over a workbench in his shed, where he repairs antique clocks with a precision that seems almost supernatural. The rhythmic tick-tock of 100 different timepieces is the only heartbeat his house has known for decades. He is a man who has cultivated silence the way some men cultivate gardens. But Elias Thorne is a lie. 30 years ago, in the smoke-filled backrooms of East Harlem, he was known by a different name, the Architect. He wasn't the man who pulled the trigger, and he wasn't the man who sold the poison on the street corners. He was the brain. He was the one who designed the logistical webs for the Moretti crime family, a man who could move millions of dollars and tons of cargo across borders without leaving a single fingerprint. He knew where every body was buried because he was the one who chose the holes, calculated the depth and ensured the soil would never be disturbed. He was the master of the shadows, the man who made the impossible look routine. But after a federal crackdown and a personal tragedy that cost him his only son, a boy not much older than Leo, Elias made a trade. He gave the government enough to dismantle his rivals, made himself too expensive for the Morettis to kill, and then he vanished. He traded the concrete jungle for the river, seeking a silence that could finally drown out the screams of a past he could never truly outrun. For 30 years, the plan worked. The river was his sanctuary, but the world is changing, and a new breed of predator has arrived in the Hudson Valley. They don't wear silk suits or carry the codes of the old world. They are the river rats, a crew of low-level thugs led by a 30-something sociopath named Jax. Jax is the kind of man who sees a sunset and only thinks about how much the light reflects off a dollar bill. He's the muscle for a group of corrupt local developers and a crooked county commissioner who have a vision for this stretch of the river. They want to tear down the old docks, dredge the mud, and build a luxury marina for the elite of Manhattan. Every other homeowner along the shore has already been bullied into selling or has simply disappeared under the pressure of mysterious fires and rising insurance costs. Every home except for the weathered wooden house at the end of the point. To Jax, Elias Thorne is just a stubborn old fossil, a relic of a forgotten era standing in the way of a multi-million-dollar payday. Jax and his crew didn't realize that when you try to push a mountain, you're the one who ends up breaking. But for Elias, the struggle wasn't about the land. He didn't care about the property value or the view. He stayed because the river was the only thing that didn't ask him questions about his past. His only connection to the living world was Leo. The boy lived in a nearby trailer park with a mother who worked 3 jobs and a father who was rotting in a state penitentiary. Leo was nonverbal, his voice stolen by the trauma of seeing things a child should never see. He spent his days wandering the riverbanks, collecting smooth stones and bits of driftwood. He had found a silent kinship with Elias. They would sit on the pier for hours, the old man and the boy, neither of them saying a word, yet understanding everything. Elias, who had sworn he would never care for another soul, found himself teaching the boy how to read the river's currents, how to tell when a storm was brewing by the way the water turned a specific shade of leaden grey. He saw his own lost son in the boy's wide, haunted eyes. One afternoon, Leo had handed Elias a broken silver pocket watch. The casing was dented, the glass was cracked, and the internal gears were jammed with grit. It was a cheap piece of metal, but to Leo, it was the Holy Grail. Elias took it to his workshop, his steady hands moving with the grace of a surgeon as he began the painstaking process of making the time flow again. That watch became a symbol, a hope that things, no matter how broken, could be made right. The conflict with Jax's crew ignited slowly, like a smouldering fire in a dry forest. It started with small things, a slashed tire on Elias's old truck, a dead phone line, the power being cut in the middle of a freezing night. Then came the brick through the front window, shattered glass spraying across the floor where Elias sat reading. Any other man would have called the police, but Elias knew better. He had seen the sheriff sharing a steak dinner with the county commissioner at the local diner. He knew the law in Oakhaven was a tool for those with the deepest pockets, so he endured it. He sat in the dark, his face a mask of terrifying, stoic calm. His internal struggle was agonizing. Every time Jax's men laughed as they drove past his house, kicking up dust and gravel, the ghost of the architect whispered in his ear. The architect knew how to make people disappear. He knew how to dismantle a man's life until there was nothing left but a memory of failure. But Elias Thorne wanted to be a good man. He wanted to believe that he could survive this without becoming the monster he used to serve. He was a lion trying to pretend he was a sheep, even as the wolves began to bite at his heels. He kept his head down, his limp pronounced, his voice trembling just enough to make them think he was afraid. He was playing a role, the performance of a lifetime, hoping they would lose interest and move on. But sociopaths like Jax don't move on. They escalate. They see patience as weakness and silence as an invitation. On a rainy Tuesday, when the sky was the color of a bruised lung and the river was churning with debris, Jax decided he was tired of waiting. He saw Leo walking along the muddy bank, heading toward Elias's house with a small bag of smooth stones. Jax didn't want to hurt the boy, not really, but he wanted to send a message that the old man couldn't ignore. He and 2 of his thugs cornered the child near the edge of a steep embankment. They didn't use weapons. They used their size and their cruelty. They pushed the boy into the freezing mud, laughing as he scrambled to get back up, his small chest heaving with silent sobs. Jax reached down and snatched the silver pocket watch from Leo's pocket, the watch Elias had been working on, the watch that was almost whole again. Jax held it up, mocking the boy's distress, before shoving Leo back down into the silt. When the boy finally crawled to the steps of Elias's porch, shivering, covered in filth, and his eyes wide with a terror that reached back years into his past, something in the atmosphere changed. The air seemed to grow heavy, the temperature dropping as if the sun itself had retreated in shame. Elias opened the door and looked down at the broken child on his doorstep. He didn't move for a long time. He didn't shout, and he didn't cry out. He simply reached out a hand, pulled Leo inside, and wrapped him in a warm wool blanket. He cleaned the mud from the boy's face with a tenderness that didn't match the expression in his eyes. In that moment, the old man died. The eccentric retiree, the clock fixer, the quiet fisherman, he was gone, evaporated into the mist of the Hudson. In his place stood the architect, the man who designed the holes, the man who knew that when the system fails, you don't call for help. You become the solution. Elias looked toward his basement door, a heavy oak portal he hadn't locked in years. Deep beneath the floorboards, beneath the rust and the memories, the tools of his trade were waiting. The silence of the house was no longer a sanctuary. It was the quiet before a very different kind of storm. The shivering didn't stop, even after Elias had wrapped Leo in 3 different wool blankets and sat him next to the old cast-iron stove. The boy's teeth chattered with a rhythmic metallic sound that seemed to sync up with the dozens of clocks ticking on the walls. For Elias, every tick was a reminder of a life he had tried to leave behind, and every shudder from the boy was a needle in a wound that had never truly healed. He watched the boy stare at his empty, mud-stained hands, the hands that should have been holding a silver pocket watch. That watch was more than just a machine. It was a bridge to a father, a promise of a future, and Jax had snapped that bridge in 2 just for the pleasure of hearing it crack. But the real nightmare was only beginning. Outside, the rain turned from a drizzle into a punishing downpour, and through the distorted glass of the kitchen window, Elias saw the headlights, 2 sets of them, cutting through the fog like the eyes of deep-sea predators. Jax and his crew weren't leaving. They were circling. They drove their trucks onto the edge of Elias's property, the heavy tires churning the grass into a graveyard of mud. They revved their engines, the roar of the modified exhausts drowning out the peaceful sounds of the river. It was a siege, a psychological grinding meant to break a man who they believed was already brittle. Elias stayed in the shadows of his own home. He didn't turn on the lights. He knew that in the dark, he was no longer a 72-year-old man with a limp. In the dark, the geography of the house became an extension of his own body. He felt the vibration of the trucks in his marrow. He knew exactly where the floorboards creaked and where the shadows were deepest. As he watched the silhouettes of the men inside the trucks, men who thought they were the masters of this valley, a cold, familiar sensation began to settle in his chest. It was the feeling of a master builder looking at a flawed blueprint. He saw their mistakes before they even made them. He saw their arrogance as a structural weakness. The next morning, the intimidation moved from the physical to the legal. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish that looked alien against the grit of the Hudson shoreline, pulled up behind the trucks. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out, holding a briefcase like a shield. This was the developer's lawyer, accompanied by a man Elias recognized from the local papers, County Commissioner Miller. They didn't come to the door. They stood by the pier, pointing at the water, talking loudly enough for the wind to carry their words to the porch. They spoke of eminent domain, of public interest, and of safety hazards that would necessitate the immediate demolition of the Thorn residence. Elias listened from behind the screen door, his hands steady as he gripped a mug of black coffee. He saw the sheriff's cruiser parked 100 yards away, the officer inside leaning back, a toothpick in his mouth, watching the show with the bored indifference of a man who had already been paid for his silence. It was a perfect trap. The law was a wall, the thugs were the hammer, and Elias was supposed to be the nail. He felt the weight of the system pressing down on him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the days he sat in the high-backed chairs of Harlem, calculating the cost of doing business with the devil. But what they didn't understand was that Elias Thorn had built those walls. He knew where the mortar was thin. As the commissioner laughed and patted Jax on the shoulder, Elias felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Clarity. He looked at Leo, who was sitting on the floor, meticulously lining up small grey river stones in a perfect circle. The boy was trying to create order in a world that had become chaos. Elias realized then that he couldn't protect this boy by being a victim. He couldn't win this by playing by the rules of men who had no honor. He had to go back to the only language these people understood. He had to speak in the language of the architect. When the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the river a dark, bruised purple, Elias made his move. He waited until Leo's mother, frantic and exhausted, came to collect the boy. He watched them walk away toward the trailer park, the boy looking back over his shoulder at the old house as if he were leaving a fortress. Once they were gone and the trucks had retreated to the local tavern to celebrate their progress, Elias walked to the center of his workshop. He moved a heavy oak workbench that weighed 400 pounds, his muscles straining with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a man of his age. Beneath the workbench was a rug, and beneath the rug was a trapdoor, sealed with a sophisticated electronic lock that hadn't seen power in 3 decades. He entered a code, a sequence of numbers that represented the date his son had died. With a hiss of hydraulic pressure, The seal broke. Elias descended into a small concrete-lined room that smelled of cold air and old secrets. On a metal shelf sat a sealed pelican case, dust-free and black as obsidian. He didn't open it immediately. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the basement echoing the silence of his soul. He knew that by opening this box he was ending the life of Elias Thorne, the peace he had built, the quiet days on the pier, the simple joy of fixing a clock. It would all be sacrificed. But as he thought of the silver watch in Jax's pocket and the mud on Leo's face, the sacrifice felt like a bargain. He snapped the latches. Inside, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, there was a ledger, a book bound in cracked leather, filled with names, dates, and account numbers that could topple half the political structure of the Northeast. There was a satellite phone with an encrypted frequency that bypassed every tower in the state. And there was a small velvet-lined box containing a set of tools that had nothing to do with clocks. They were surveillance devices, miniature microphones, and digital interceptors, the eyes and ears of a man who used to control the flow of information for the most powerful family in the city. Elias picked up the satellite phone. It took a moment for the screen to glow to life, the blue light reflecting in his eyes, making them look like cold diamonds. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 30 years. He didn't expect anyone to answer. He expected a deadline, a ghost of a past long gone. But after 3 rings, a voice answered. It was a raspy, ancient voice, a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed under a boot. "Architect," the voice whispered, the word carrying a weight of shock and reverence. "I need a blueprint," Elias said, his voice no longer the shaky rasp of a retiree, but the steady, lethal tone of a commander. "I need everything on a developer named Sterling and a county commissioner named Miller. Every debt, every secret, every ghost in their closet. And I need it by dawn." "They told me you were dead," the voice replied. "I was," Elias said, looking up at the ceiling toward the house he had loved. "But the world wouldn't let me stay that way." The middle of the night found Elias back on his porch, but he wasn't sitting in his rocking chair. He was moving through the woods that bordered his property, his limp completely gone. His body had remembered the training, the muscle memory of a man who had survived the deadliest streets in America. He moved with a predatory grace, his dark clothing blending into the shadows of the hemlocks. He watched the river rats at their camp down the shore. They were drinking, bragging about how they were going to burn the old fossil out of his hole. Jax was there, leaning against his truck, tossing Leo's silver watch up and down in the air like a common toy. Elias didn't feel anger. Anger was a luxury for the weak. He felt only a cold, professional detachment. He began to plant the first seeds of his plan. He didn't use bombs. He used information. He placed a small waterproof transmitter under the chassis of the commissioner's sedan, which was parked at a nearby motel. He slipped a digital gift into the sheriff's home Wi-Fi network from the edge of the woods. He was weaving a web, just as he had done in the old days, but this time he wasn't doing it for profit. He was doing it for a boy who couldn't speak, and for a river that deserved better than to be paved over with the greed of small men. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the Hudson, Elias returned to his house. He sat at his kitchen table, the satellite phone buzzing with a series of encrypted files. He scrolled through them, his eyes narrowing as he saw the connections. The developer was bankrupt, laundering money from a cartel in the city to stay afloat. The commissioner was taking kickbacks to fund a gambling debt that reached into the millions. They weren't powerful men. They were desperate men. And desperate men are the easiest to break. Elias looked at the silver watch he had been fixing for Leo. It sat on his workbench, still missing its back casing, its heartbeat steady but incomplete. He realized that the watch wasn't the only thing that needed to be finished. The old man might have been a fossil, but the architect was a master of demolition, and he was about to show Jax and his crew that when you try to tear down a man's home, you'd better make sure he isn't the one who designed the foundation you're standing on. The war had begun, and before it was over, the Hudson would claim more than just the morning mist. Stay with me, because the way Elias begins to dismantle these predators piece by piece is something you won't want to miss. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps me tell more stories of justice and redemption. And remember to drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in Elias's shoes? I can't wait to read your thoughts. Now let's see what happens when the first river rat realizes he's no longer the hunter. The air inside the Riverside house had grown thin, vibrating with a tension that felt like the hum of a high-voltage wire. Elias Thorne sat in his dark kitchen, the only light coming from the glowing screen of the satellite phone. He wasn't looking at the data anymore. He was looking at his own reflection in the window, seeing a ghost he thought he had buried in the concrete of a Harlem construction site decades ago. But the world outside wouldn't let him be a ghost. It wanted a monster. And as the rain lashed against the siding, Elias realized that the river rats weren't just a nuisance anymore. They were a symptom of a rot that ran deeper than the river itself. The situation worsened when the sun stayed hidden behind a thick, suffocating layer of grey clouds. Jax, fueled by a mixture of cheap whiskey and an ego that was beginning to fray at the edges, decided to tighten the noose. He didn't come to the house this time. Instead, he went after the only thing Elias had left to lose. By mid-morning, 2 of Jax's men were parked at the entrance of the trailer park where Leo lived. They didn't do anything illegal. Not yet. They just sat there, engines idling, staring at Leo's mother as she walked to the bus stop. It was a silent promise of violence, a psychological weight intended to crush her spirit so she would keep Leo away from the crazy old man on the point. Elias saw the fear in her eyes when she brought Leo by one last time to drop off a small bag of clothes. She didn't say a word, but her hands were shaking as she handed the bag to Elias. She was a mother who had already lost her husband to the system, and she couldn't lose her son to a war she didn't understand. She took Leo's hand and led him away, and for the first time in years, Elias felt a physical ache in his chest. He watched the boy look back, his eyes searching for the silver watch, for the safety of the workshop, for the man who didn't judge his silence. But Elias remained behind the screen door, a shadow among shadows. He knew that if he stepped out now, he would be bringing the war directly to their doorstep, but the obstacles didn't stop there. An hour later, Sheriff Miller's cruiser pulled into the mud-slicked driveway. This time, the sheriff didn't stay in the car. He walked up to the porch, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, a smirk of feigned concern on his face. He told Elias that there had been complaints about his mental stability. He mentioned that the county was looking into an emergency protective order that would remove him from the property for his own safety. It was a legal kidnapping, a way to clear the land without firing a shot. "Just sell the place, Elias," the sheriff said, leaning against the railing. "Go find a nice condo in Florida. This river is moving on, and you're just an anchor holding it back." Elias looked at the sheriff, and for a split second, the architect peered out from behind his tired eyes. He didn't see a lawman. He saw a mid-level manager who had overextended his credit. He saw the sweat on the sheriff's upper lip and the way his eyes darted toward the satellite phone on the kitchen table. The sheriff was scared. He was a small man, playing a big man's game, and Elias knew exactly how to break him. But he didn't. Not yet. He simply nodded, whispered a hollow, "I'll think about it," and closed the door. Inside the silence of the house, Elias's mind became a battlefield. He remembered his son, Michael. Michael had been 10 years old, a boy who loved the city lights and thought his father was a king. Elias had tried to keep him away from the family business, but in that world, the sins of the father are always visited upon the son. A rival family had sent a message, and Michael had been the envelope. Elias had spent 30 years trying to wash the blood of that realization off his hands. He had told himself that by living in silence, by fixing clocks and helping a nonverbal boy, he was somehow balancing the scales. But now, he understood the flaw in his design. You can't build a fortress on top of a swamp and expect it to stay level. His past wasn't something he could hide from. It was a tool he had neglected. He thought about Jax, sitting in his truck, playing with Leo's watch. He thought about the commissioner, counting money that smelled like the river's silt. He felt a cold, crystalline anger that was more powerful than any fear. He realized that to protect the innocent, he had to become the very thing he hated. He had to use the architecture of fear to dismantle the world of his enemies. And that was the moment the turning point arrived. It wasn't a gunshot or an explosion. It was the arrival of a single text message on the satellite phone. It contained a set of coordinates and a single word: confirmed. The psychological warfare began at midnight. Caleb, one of Jax's most aggressive thugs, woke up in his trailer to a strange silence. His dog wasn't barking. The crickets were quiet. He stepped outside with a flashlight, expecting to see a prowler. Instead, he saw nothing. His truck, a massive lifted beast that was his pride and joy, was gone. There were no tire tracks in the mud, no broken glass, no sound of an engine. It had simply vanished into the night. He followed a faint trail of disturbed grass down to the riverbank. There, about 50 yards out into the dark, churning Hudson, he saw the roof of his truck. It was submerged in a shallow sandbar, the headlights miraculously still glowing underwater like the eyes of a drowned monster. But that wasn't the part that made his blood run cold. When he swam out to it, desperate to save his vehicle, he found that every door had been welded shut from the outside with professional-grade precision. On the windshield, protected by a layer of waterproof plastic, was a note written in a precise, elegant hand: "Logistics is the art of moving things where they don't belong." The next morning, another of Jax's crew, a man they called Snake, went to his mailbox. Inside, he didn't find bills or flyers. He found a single Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of his 2 daughters sitting in their elementary school cafeteria, eating lunch. The photo had been taken from inside the school, from an angle that suggested the photographer was standing right behind them. There was no threat written on the back. There didn't need to be. The message was clear: "Your walls are made of paper. I am already inside." By noon, the river rats were no longer laughing. The camp was quiet, the bravado replaced by a twitchy, paranoid energy. Jax tried to rally them, screaming that it was just the old fossil playing tricks, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept reaching into his pocket, clutching Leo's silver watch like a talisman, but even he could feel the shift in the air. The river didn't feel like a playground anymore. It felt like a trap. Every ripple in the water, every rustle of the leaves, felt like the movement of a ghost. Jax didn't know that Elias was watching him through a high-powered thermal scope from the attic window. Elias wasn't looking for a target. He was looking for a crack. He saw the way Jax's hands shook when he lit a cigarette. He saw the way the men started to argue, pointing fingers and accusing each other of being followed. The architect was doing what he did best. He was redesigning their reality. He was taking their sense of security and replacing it with the absolute certainty of their own vulnerability. But Elias knew that this was only the first phase. The developer and the commissioner wouldn't be scared off by missing trucks or photographs. They had too much to lose. They would push Jax to do something drastic, something final. And that was exactly what Elias wanted. He needed them to come to him. He needed them to enter the fortress he had spent 30 years unknowingly preparing. As the storm clouds gathered for a final violent surge, Elias went back to his workshop. He picked up the back casing of Leo's watch, the silver glinting in the dim light. He had the tools, he had the skill, and now he had the will. He wasn't just fixing a watch anymore. He was resetting the timeline of Oakhaven. He was going to show them that time doesn't just pass, it collects. And for the men who had tried to steal a boy's future and an old man's peace, the bill was finally coming due. Stay with me for the final part of this journey, where the river rises and the architect reveals his masterpiece. The climax is a masterclass in strategy and justice that you have to see to believe. If this story is gripping you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the conclusion. And please tell me in the comments, do you think Elias is going too far, or is this the only way to handle men like Jax? I'm waiting for your rating from 0 to 10. Now let's head into the heart of the storm. The storm that had been brewing over the Hudson Valley finally broke with a fury that felt like the sky itself was being torn apart. Thunder shook the foundations of the old wooden house, and the river rose until the water was licking at the support beams of the private pier. Inside the darkness of the workshop, Elias Thorne stood perfectly still. He wasn't the old fossil anymore. He was the center of a storm much more dangerous than the one outside. He had spent the last few hours transforming his home into a labyrinth, a masterpiece of defensive engineering designed by a man who had once secured the secrets of the most powerful criminals in America. He wasn't waiting for a miracle. He was waiting for the wolves. "Burn it down! Burn the whole thing to the ground!" Jax's voice screamed over the wind, cracked with a desperation that bordered on madness. He stood at the edge of the property, a gallon of gasoline in one hand and a flare in the other. His crew was down to 3 men. The others had vanished into the night, spooked by the ghosts Elias had conjured, the submerged trucks, the photos of their families, the feeling that they were being hunted by something they couldn't see. But Jax couldn't leave. He was too deep in debt to the developer, too far gone into his own sociopathic pride. He needed Elias Thorne dead, and he needed this land cleared or his life was over anyway. The 3 thugs moved toward the house, their flashlights cutting frantic arcs through the torrential rain. They thought they were the predators, but as they stepped onto the porch, the first cog in Elias's machine began to turn. The front door wasn't locked. It swung open with a slow, inviting creak. One thug, a man named Miller, stepped into the foyer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't see the tripwire, a thin strand of monofilament as fine as a spider's silk. When his boot hit it, there was no explosion. Instead, a heavy, grease-coated iron shutter slammed down behind him, sealing the entrance. In the sudden, absolute darkness of the hallway, Miller realized he was no longer with his friends. He was alone with the architect. Outside, Jax and the other thug, a man known as Grit, tried to force the side window. But the glass didn't shatter. It was reinforced with a polycarbonate layer that Elias had installed years ago for security. Every time they hit it, the sound echoed through the house like a funeral bell. Suddenly, the pier lights flared to life, not the soft yellow glow of the porch lamps, but a blinding industrial white that illuminated the riverbank like a stadium. Jax squinted against the glare, his silhouette cast long and jagged against the churning mud. He saw a figure standing at the end of the pier, unaffected by the wind or the rain. It was Elias, but he looked different. He looked eternal. "Come and get it, Jax!" Elias's voice was projected through the pier's sound system, calm and steady, cutting through the roar of the Hudson. "You have the watch, you have the gasoline, but you're standing on my foundation, and I've decided it's time for a renovation." Grit panicked. He turned to run back toward the trucks, but the ground beneath him had turned into a marshy trap. Elias had spent the afternoon manipulating the drainage pipes, saturating the silt, until it was nothing more than a shallow, treacherous quicksand. Grit's heavy boots sank to the knees in seconds, the thick Hudson mud suctioning him in place. He screamed for help, but Jax didn't even look back. Jax was focused on the pier. He was focused on the man who had made him feel small. Jax charged toward the water, his boots pounding against the wooden planks of the pier. He reached the end, his chest heaving, the gasoline sloshing in the container. He pointed the flare at Elias, his eyes wide with a manic, flickering light. "You think you're so smart, you old piece of trash. I'll burn you right here. I'll burn this pier and let the river take what's left." Elias didn't flinch. He reached into his Carhartt jacket and pulled out the satellite phone. "The gasoline is a nice touch, Jax. Very dramatic. But you're late. The package has already been delivered." Jax paused, the flare trembling in his hand. "What are you talking about?" "The state attorney's office received a digital file 10 minutes ago," Elias said, his voice as cold as the river spray. "It contains the commissioner's gambling logs, the developer's money laundering contracts with the city cartels, and the GPS coordinates of your little operation here. But more importantly, Jax, I sent a copy to your employer's rivals in East Harlem. They don't like it when small-town thugs draw federal heat to their front companies. By now, the people you work for are already dead men walking. They just haven't looked at their phones yet." Jax's face went pale, the bravado draining away like water through a sieve. He looked at the flare, then at the river, then back at the calm, terrifying man standing before him. He realized that Elias Thorne wasn't just a homeowner. He was a force of nature that had been dormant for 30 years, and Jax had been the one to wake it up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Leo's silver pocket watch, his fingers fumbling with the metal. I just wanted the money. They told me you were nobody." "Nobody is a dangerous thing to be, Jax," Elias said, taking a single step forward. The limp was gone, replaced by the balanced, predatory stance of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Because when you're nobody, you have nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing to lose, you can do exactly what needs to be done. Elias reached out and took the watch from Jax's hand. He didn't hit him. He didn't push him into the water. He didn't have to. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, not the local sheriff's cruiser, but the deep authoritative roar of state police units and federal vehicles. Elias had used the satellite phone to call in the people who couldn't be bought by a county commissioner. Jax dropped the gasoline, the container thudding against the wood, and sank to his knees, sobbing. He was broken, not by a fist, but by the sheer, calculated weight of a man who understood how the world truly worked. The dawn broke over the Hudson Valley with a clarity that was almost painful. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet pine and ancient stone. The pier was crowded with investigators, but Elias was no longer there. He had already retreated to his porch, sitting in his old rocking chair as if nothing had happened. He watched from a distance as Commissioner Miller and the developer were led away in handcuffs, their luxury marina project dying in the back of a police van. The local sheriff was nowhere to be found. Rumors were already spreading that he had fled across the border before the feds could knock on his door. A small figure appeared at the edge of the yard. It was Leo. He was wearing a clean yellow raincoat, his face pale but his eyes bright with a new kind of light. His mother stood a few feet behind him, her hand over her heart, looking at the old house with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Leo walked up the porch steps, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of Elias and held out his hand. Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out the silver watch. It was no longer dented or stained with mud. He had spent the remaining hours of the night in his workshop, polishing the casing until it shone like a mirror, replacing the cracked glass, and ensuring every tiny, intricate gear was perfectly aligned. He snapped the back casing into place with a satisfying, rhythmic click. He placed the watch in Leo's small palm. The boy looked at the watch, listening to the steady, healthy heartbeat of the machine. He looked up at Elias, his lips trembling. For 3 years, the world had been a place of silence and fear for Leo, but as he gripped the watch, the symbol of his father, of time, and of the man who had fought for him, the wall finally broke. "Thank you," Leo whispered. His voice was small, rusty from disuse, but it was the most beautiful sound Elias had heard in 30 years. It was a sound that carried the weight of a future that had been saved. Elias Thorne looked out at the river. He knew that his peace was likely over. The rumors of the architect's return would eventually reach the city. The family would wonder if their old brain was back in business. He would have to move soon, to find a new name and a new house on a different stretch of water. But as he watched Leo run back to his mother, the boy's laughter echoing through the morning air, Elias realized that he wasn't running anymore. He had finally used his past to build something that would last longer than any building or any crime empire. He had built a life. The moral of the story is simple. True power isn't in the ability to destroy, it's in the calculated will to protect what is innocent. The river keeps its secrets, and so does Elias Thorne. But for one small boy and one quiet town, the secrets of the architect will always be a reminder that justice, though it may be slow, is as inevitable as the tide. If this story touched your heart and showed you that it's never too late to do the right thing, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Your support allows me to keep telling these tales of hidden heroes and silent justice. Don't forget to leave a comment with your rating from 0 to 10. I want to know how you felt about Elias's final stand. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Until next time, remember, the quietest people often have the loudest stories to tell.